She was 19 years old, and she owned $11.40, a wool coat with a torn lining, a canvas satchel gone soft at the corners, and a brass compass that no longer belonged to the man who had taught her how to use it. That was the whole of her fortune on the morning the frost first silvered the fence rails, and she would tell you herself, years later, that $11.40 is not a sum a person forgets, not when it is counted out in front of you on a kitchen table by someone who owes you nothing more than that and knows it. What she did not know, standing on that frozen porch step with her breath fogging in front of her, was that 200 miles west, half buried under 3 decades of silt and river growth, there was a stone dam that everyone in the county had written off as a ruin, and sealed inside its foundation was a lead box that would, in time, put her name on land no living person remembered was hers to claim. But that comes later. Settle in, and if you'd like, tell us where you're listening from tonight, because this is a long road, and it starts, as so many of these do, with a girl who had nowhere particular to be, and a winter that was not going to wait for her to find somewhere. The ranch she was leaving sat in a shallow valley, where the grass turned gold early, and stayed that way, browning by August, and the house itself was a low clapboard structure her stepfather had built himself, sturdy and unlovely, the kind of place that existed to be useful and nothing more. She had lived there 7 years, since she was 12, since her mother had married a man with dry hands and a ledger for a heart, and in all that time she had never once heard him raise his voice. That was the strange mercy of him. He was never cruel in the way stories are usually cruel. He simply did arithmetic, and she had, at some point without either of them quite noticing, become a figure in it that no longer balanced. The cold that autumn came in sharp and early, 3 weeks ahead of what the almanac promised, and it settled over the valley the way it does before a hard winter, turning the mud to iron and the water troughs to sheets of gray glass by sunrise. She had noticed it first in her hands, the way the joints in her fingers ached when she gripped the well rope, and she had thought, without alarm, only with a kind of tired recognition, that this was going to be a difficult season for anyone without a roof they could call their own. She did not yet know it would be her season. She only knew the frost was early, the grass was already brittle underfoot, and somewhere behind her, in the house she had scrubbed and swept and tended for 7 years without her name ever once appearing on a single deed or ledger line, a decision had already been made about her, quietly, the way most decisions in that house were made, with numbers, not words. She had been 6 years old when her grandfather first put a stone in her hand and told her to feel its weight before she ever tried to move it, and that had been the winter after her father drowned crossing the Sweetwater with a wagon load of salt, the winter her mother stopped singing in the mornings and started counting things instead, coins, days, the miles between what they had and what they needed. The old man had come to live with them that same season, arriving with a mule, a leather roll of tools gone soft and dark with age, and a way of speaking that made silence feel like part of the sentence. He had built things his whole life, culverts, root cellars, the low stone walls that still held back the Hendersons' east pasture 30 years on. And he had looked at her, small and solemn on the porch step, and decided, in the unhurried way he decided everything, that she would learn it too. He taught her the way a man teaches something he loves and expects to leave behind. He taught her to read a stone before she touched it, to find the grain the way you'd find the grain in a plank of oak, to know which face would split clean under a chisel and which would shatter and betray you. He taught her that a wall built without a plumb line was a wall lying to whoever looked at it, and that the ground itself kept a memory, that frost heave and water and 40 years of pressure left marks a patient eye could read like handwriting. He taught her patience most of all, though he never called it that. He called it listening to the material. Her mother remarried when she was 11, a widower with land and cattle, and a manner of speaking that always sounded like he was closing a transaction, and the old man stayed on in a room off the kitchen until he died in his sleep the winter she turned 14, quietly, the way he had done most things, leaving her his compass, brass, dented on one edge, the needle still true, and nothing else that anyone thought worth writing down. She had kept it wrapped in a handkerchief in the bottom of her trunk for 5 years, taking it out sometimes at night to watch the needle settle, north, always north, as if the thing itself were reminding her that some directions did not change no matter what else did. She thought of him now, standing at the well with her aching fingers and the frost thick on the rope, and she thought that he would have looked at this early cold the way he looked at every hard sign the land gave, not as misfortune, but as information, worth reading closely, worth trusting more than anyone's promises. It was her grandfather who had first shown her the difference between a wall that would stand for a season and a wall that would stand for 100 years, though she had not understood at the time that he was teaching her anything at all. She had thought, at 9 and 10 years old, that she was only following him around the dry creek beds and the old quarry cuts because there was nothing else to do, because her mother was occupied with the new baby and the new husband's opinions about how a house should be run. But he had a way of narrating his work under his breath, not quite to her and not quite to himself, and she had absorbed it the way a child absorbs a language spoken around her without ever being formally taught it. "Look for the stone that wants to lie flat," he would say, turning a piece of river rock in his cracked hands. "Don't fight it into a shape it doesn't want. A stone laid against its own grain will heave itself loose the first winter that tests it, and you'll never know why, and you'll blame the frost instead of your own impatience." She had watched him lay a springhouse foundation when she was 12, watched him choose each stone with the deliberation of a man selecting words for a letter he could not afford to send twice, watched him tap each one with the flat of a trowel to hear whether it answered solid or hollow. "A stone that rings true," he told her, "is a stone that has already made its peace with gravity." She had not known, standing at the well with the frost thickening on the rope, that she would come to need this exact knowledge, this exact patience, more than she needed food or shelter or the good opinion of anyone left living. But some part of her, some quiet ledger she kept without meaning to, had been totaling it up for years. The weight of a stone in the hand, the sound of a hollow one, the way water moved around an obstruction and told you, if you watched long enough, exactly where it wanted to go and exactly where a man could make it go instead. He had never called it an inheritance. He had called it attention. "Pay attention to the material," he'd said, "and the material will tell you what it can bear." She thought of this now not as memory exactly, but as something closer to instruction still arriving, still being delivered across the 5 years since his death, the way sound travels a long distance through cold air and reaches you later than the moment it was made. The well rope creaked. Her fingers had gone past aching into a kind of numbness that was almost peace. Somewhere behind her, in the house that was no longer going to be her house much longer, she could hear her stepfather's boots on the kitchen floor, an unhurried, deliberate sound, the sound of a man walking toward a decision he had already made and was only now getting around to announcing. She set the bucket down on the lip of the well and did not go inside right away, because there was a particular kind of dread that came from entering a room before the person waiting in it had finished arranging his face, and she had learned, over 19 years of living in that house, to let him finish. The morning was the color of a nickel, low clouds moving fast from the northwest, the first real cold of the season, riding underneath them, the way a current rides underneath a river's calm surface, invisible until it pulled at your ankles. She could smell wood smoke from the kitchen stove, and, fainter, the mineral smell of the well water still on her hands, and beneath both of these the smell of the barn, hay, manure, oiled leather, that had been the smell of every morning of her life since she was 6 years old, so constant she had stopped noticing it until this particular morning, when some instinct told her to notice everything, because she would not be smelling it much longer. She looked toward the eastern fence line, where the land dropped toward the river in a long, unhurried slope, stubble fields gone gold and brittle, and beyond them, the dam site her grandfather had worked on decades before anyone else in the county thought there was reason to put stone into that particular bend of water. She had walked past it 1,000 times without truly seeing it, the way a person walks past their own reflection in a dark window. It was simply there, a collapsed shape, half swallowed by silt and blackberry cane, the kind of ruin nobody bothers to explain to a child, because it does not seem to require explanation. It is only old, only broken, only what happens to things. Her stepfather's boots reached the kitchen doorway and stopped. She heard the scrape of a chair being pulled out, deliberate, unhurried, and she understood that he was sitting down at the table not because he was tired, but because he wanted the conversation to happen across a surface, with a document on it, the way he conducted every transaction that mattered to him, the sale of a heifer, the settling of a debt with the feed store, the correction of an account that had grown, in his estimation, too generous. She picked the bucket back up. Her hands did not shake, which surprised her a little, distantly, the way you notice your own calm from outside it. The cold had gotten into the water, and the water had gotten into her, and she thought, not for the first time, that there was a kind of clarity that only arrived once a person stopped hoping for a different outcome than the one already in motion. She crossed the yard toward the house, toward the sound of the chair legs settling on the floorboards, toward whatever number he had already decided upon and was, at that moment, arranging on the table in front of him like a man laying out change for a purchase he considered fair. The kitchen smelled of lamp oil and the particular staleness of a room that had been shut against the morning air on purpose. He had a ledger open in front of him, the same brown ledger he had kept since before her mother died, its corners softened to felt by years of his thumb turning pages, and beside it he had set a small tin box that she recognized as the one he kept coin in for the church collection and for paying the boy who hauled ice in summer. She set the bucket by the stove and did not sit down, because he had not asked her to, and because standing seemed, in that moment, the last small thing she could choose for herself. He did not look up right away. He finished a line of figures with the stub of pencil he favored, the one worn down to the length of a finger joint, and only then did he set the pencil across the page, parallel to the margin, the way he set every tool down when he was finished using it. Outside the window behind him, the sky had the flat white look of a sky deciding on snow without committing to it yet, and she found herself watching that instead of his face, because his face had already told her everything it was going to tell her, which was nothing. He opened the tin box. The coins inside had been counted already, she could tell, because they were stacked in small towers instead of loose, and he began to move them across the table toward her one stack at a time, naming the amount as though reading it from the ledger, rather than deciding it in that moment. $11. He said it plainly, the way he might have announced the weight of a calf at market, and then he added the 40 cents in a small loose pile beside the stacks, 4 dimes, laid down individually, and she watched his fingers do it, and thought about how carefully he must have gone through the account books the night before to arrive at a figure he considered settled and fair, a figure that closed something rather than opened it. He did not explain the arithmetic behind it, the years of feed and boarding and mending set against the years of her labor in the yard and the kitchen and the birthing shed, because in his mind, she understood, the arithmetic had already been done long ago, quietly, the way he did all his sums, and this moment was only the announcement of a total already reached. He slid the ledger half an inch closer to himself, a small motion, almost unconscious, the gesture of a man protecting a document from a spill that had not happened, and he said that he expected she would want to gather her things before the light went, and that the wagon could take her as far as the crossing if she wished it, though not farther, because the horse had work to do that afternoon that could not wait on her account. She did not answer him right away. She let the $11.40 sit there on the table between them, the coins catching the gray light from the window in a way that made them look almost warm, almost generous, and she thought that this was perhaps the cruelest part of it, that money could be made to look like kindness simply by the way it was arranged. She reached out and gathered it into her palm, slowly, counting it again herself, though she did not need to, because she wanted him to see her count it, wanted him to know that she understood exactly what he was giving her, and exactly what he was not, and that she would not pretend otherwise for his comfort or her own. He watched her do this without any change in his face. He was not a cruel man, not in the way the word was usually meant, not a man who raised his voice or his hand, and she had never once seen him strike anything harder than a nail, but there was a coldness in him that ran deeper than temper, a coldness that lived in the ledgers and the sums and the careful laying down of dimes, and she understood, sitting there with the coins warming in her fist, that this coldness was worse than any shouting could have been, because shouting could at least be answered. She rose from the table and went to the room that had been hers, the small room off the kitchen that had once belonged to a hired girl before her mother married into the house, and she began to gather what there was to gather, which was not much: a spare dress, a shawl that had been her mother's, folded now for 11 years in the bottom of a trunk, a tin cup, a folding knife, and the compass, which she took last, lifting it from where it had sat on the sill, catching the morning light every day since her grandfather had pressed it into her hand, and told her North never lied to a person who knew how to ask it properly. She did not cry doing this. She had done her crying already, in the years before, in the birthing shed at 3 in the morning with a ewe in trouble and no one to help her, in the garden in July with her hands raw from weeding rows that were never truly hers, and there was none left over now for this particular Tuesday, only a clear, cold attention to the task of leaving, the same attention her grandfather had taught her to bring to a wall that needed reading before it could be built. She came back out with the satchel over her shoulder, and her stepfather was still at the table, the ledger closed now, his hands folded on top of it, as though he were waiting for something else to be said, though there was nothing else, and she stood in the doorway a moment longer than she needed to, looking at the kitchen, where she had spent 9 years of her life, memorizing it the way her grandfather had taught her to memorize the lay of a slope, before deciding where to place the first stone. Then she turned and walked out into a morning so cold it had a taste to it, metal and frost, and the faint char of a banked fire somewhere behind her, and she did not look back at the house, because she had already memorized it, and there was nothing more the house could give her by being looked at twice. The yard was silvered with the first hard frost of the season. Each blade of dead grass rhymed white and brittle underfoot, and her breath went up ahead of her in a thin gray rope that the wind took apart, before it had risen the height of a fence post. She counted her steps the way she had been taught to count paces when there was no chain to measure with, out of old habit more than need, and somewhere past the 40th step she heard the dog bark once behind her and then stop, as if even the dog understood there was nothing left to announce. The road that led away from the ranch was the same road she had walked 100 times to town, with a wagon and a purpose, but walking it now, with only a satchel and $11.40 folded into a handkerchief in her coat pocket, it seemed a different road entirely, longer somehow, though the distance had not changed, and would not change no matter how long she walked it. The land on either side lay flat and pale under the low autumn sun, the grass gone the color of old rope, and far off to the west the mountains sat blue and indifferent against a sky that had not yet decided whether it would snow that week or the next. She did not know yet which direction she meant to take beyond the first crossroads. She knew only that she meant to walk until the ranch was small enough behind her that she could stop hearing it in her mind, the closing of the ledger, the particular flat courtesy of her stepfather's voice, reading out the sum as though it were a fair wage for 9 years, rather than the exact price of being rid of her. She kept the compass in her coat pocket where she could feel its weight against her hip with each step. The brass casing warmed faintly by her own body, though the morning was bitter, and from time to time her thumb found the little scratch on its lid without her meaning it to, the mark her grandfather had made the winter he taught her to read a slope by eye alone. She did not open it. There was no need yet to know a direction more particular than away, and away was a direction her feet already understood without asking her mind's permission, one foot and then the other, the frost cracking thin and bright beneath her boots, the sun climbing slow and cold above the flat gray line of the horizon. By mid-morning, the road had narrowed to little more than a suggestion in the frozen mud, 2 ruts left by freight wagons that had not passed this way since the last hauling season, and she followed them because they were the only proof that anyone had ever gone in this direction and returned to tell of it. The land here did not announce itself the way the ranch land had, with fences and water troughs and the particular arrangement of things that men had decided mattered. It simply lay open, sage and frost-burned grass stretching toward a line of hills the color of old iron, and she found she did not mind the emptiness of it so much as she had expected to. Emptiness asked nothing of her. It did not require her to be grateful for 11 years of a roof, or to answer for the shape of her face which had always been. Her stepfather said without heat, too much her mother's, and not enough anyone's who mattered. She ate a little of the bread near noon, standing rather than sitting, because sitting felt like a decision to stay, and she was not ready to make any decision at all beyond forward. The $11.40 rode in a small cloth purse pinned inside her coat, and she had already begun, without quite meaning to dividing it in her head the way her grandfather had taught her to divide any resource that would not renew itself. A portion for now, a portion for later, and a portion she was not permitted to touch except in true emergency, though what counted as true emergency out here, she did not yet know, and hoped she would not learn too quickly. The hills came closer through the afternoon, not by any speed she could feel, but by the slow accumulation of an hour becoming 2, 3, the light shifting from the flat white of morning into something with faint gold in it, low and slanting, the kind of light her grandfather used to say was better than a lamp for judging whether a wall stood true, because a lamp lied and the low sun never did. She thought of him more in that stretch of walking than she had allowed herself to in the weeks since the ledger was closed. Not the sickness at the end of him, not the last months when his hands shook too badly to set a level, but the earlier years, the ones she had folded away because they were easier to carry that way, small, and pressed flat like a letter kept in a coat pocket. By the time the sun dropped fully behind the iron-colored hills, she had not yet decided where she would sleep, and the cold that had been merely bitter in the morning was beginning to sharpen into something with intention in it, something that meant to test her, and she quickened her step without admitting to herself that she was afraid. The road had narrowed by then into little more than a suggestion of itself, 2 ruts worn by wagons that had not passed this way in some years, grass grown up between them tall enough to brush her skirt, and she followed it, not because she trusted where it led, but because a road, even an old one, even one going nowhere in particular, was company of a kind, evidence that other feet had once needed to go somewhere too. She had eaten nothing since the biscuit that morning, had drunk from a creek an hour back that tasted faintly of iron and cress, and her satchel had grown no lighter for all that its contents were few, the strap having worn a groove into her shoulder that she suspected would still be there come summer. The compass rode in her coat pocket, and every so often, without quite deciding to, she found her hand closing around it, not to read it. There was no reading a compass in failing light, and besides, direction was not what she lacked just then, but for the plain animal comfort of a known shape against her palm. The land here had begun to change in a way she recognized more by instinct than by any name she could put to it. The scrub gave way to stands of cottonwood, bent and silvered, growing in a rough line that told her, before she had consciously reasoned it out, that water ran nearby, or had once, or did, in seasons other than this one. Her grandfather had taught her to read a line of trees the way other men read a letter, and she followed the line now with the particular attention he had drilled into her over years of walking beside him, saying nothing, watching where his eyes went before he told her what they'd found. The trees led her down a long grade she had not seen coming until she was already descending it, the ground falling away in shallow terraces, as though something had once been built to hold water back, and had, over a long enough time, given up the effort. At the bottom of the grade the light was nearly gone, the gold gone out of it entirely now, leaving only a bruised gray that made distances hard to judge, and it was in that failing gray that she first saw the shape of the thing, low, long, half swallowed by drifted silt and the roots of willow that had grown up through what should not have permitted growing, a wall, or the memory of one, running crosswise to the dry bed like a spine laid down and forgotten. She stood at the top of the last terrace for a long moment without moving closer, the cold forgotten for the length of that moment, some old instinct in her, his instinct really, lent to her and never quite given back, telling her that a wall built with intention, even a ruined one, was never nothing. She came down off the terrace slowly, testing each step before she gave it her weight, because the silt here was not like the silt above it. It had a give to it that spoke of water still moving somewhere beneath, unseen, patient, the way water always was patient, her grandfather used to say, more patient than any man who ever tried to outlast it. The willow roots had done what roots do to old work, prying at the seams the way years had pried at everything else in this country, and yet the wall held its line with a stubbornness that no natural slump of earth could account for. She crouched at its base and put her bare hand against the stone, and the stone was cold in the way all stone was cold at that hour, but there was something else in it too, something under the cold, a flatness to the face of it that no river had ground there on its own. Cut stone, fitted stone, Not fieldstone tumbled into a bank by flood and left to make its own accidental order, but stone that had been chosen, turned, set with a level hand, and a purpose that outlived the hand that had set it. She sat back on her heels and looked at the length of it running off into the dusk in both directions, longer than she had first taken it for, and she found herself doing the thing he had taught her to do without ever calling it teaching. She began, without deciding to, counting courses. 1 course, 2, the mortar joints where mortar had survived at all, showing thin and even, a mason's joints, not a farmer's, not a man building a stock pond in an afternoon, because the cattle needed water before the heat came on. Someone had meant this to last. Someone had meant this to hold something back for a long while, and it had done exactly that, long enough that the county forgot it was there at all, long enough that whatever it had once held back had gone dry and grown willow and become, in the common memory of the valley, nothing more than a bad grade no wagon would take. She did not know yet what it was for. She only knew, crouched there with the last gray light going out of the sky and her breath starting to show white in front of her for the first time that season, that the ground had just told her something the way ground sometimes did, quietly, to people who had been taught young to listen for it, that this was not the empty place everyone had ridden past for 30 years believing it to be. She stayed a long while after the light was gone entirely, her hand still on the stone, feeling for what she could not yet see. She rose at last, only because her knees had gone stiff from the cold stone beneath her, and even then she rose slowly, the way her grandfather used to rise from a survey line he had been kneeling over too long, one hand braced against his thigh, muttering about age the way a man mutters about weather, as if it were something that happened to him rather than something he was. She did not go back to the wagon that night. She built her small fire close against the old stonework instead, close enough that its light threw itself across the coursed rock and let her see, for the first time clearly, what her fingers had already told her in the dark, that this was not fieldstone piled by hand and left to settle where gravity pleased. The stones had been dressed. Someone had taken a chisel to the faces that met the waterside, squared them where the current would press hardest, and laid them in courses that broke joint the way her grandfather had shown her 100 times on 100 lesser walls, so that no single seam ran clean through the structure and gave the water a place to work its way in. It was the kind of laying that took a man who understood that stone under pressure was not decoration. It was engineering dressed up as farm work, and whoever had built it had wanted very badly for no one passing by to know the difference. She sat with that a long while, turning it over the way she had been taught to turn over a puzzle in stone before ever touching hammer to it, slowly, from every side, refusing to guess until the shape gave itself up honestly. Her grandfather had always said that a wall lied to a man who looked at it only once. You had to walk it, sit with it, come back to it in different light, before it would tell you where its weakness was and where its strength. She had thought at the time he meant only masonry. She understood now, with the fire popping low and the willow along the old spillway hissing faintly in a wind she could not feel down where she sat, that he had likely meant something larger, and that she had carried the smaller meaning for years without noticing the bigger one waiting underneath it. By the time the fire had burned down to a bed of orange coal, she had found 4 separate places along the base course where the stone had been cut, not for strength, but for shape. Small, deliberate recesses, no bigger than a folded hand, mortared shut so cleanly that a careless eye would have called them settling cracks and ridden on. She did not open any of them that night. She only marked their positions in her mind, the way she had been taught to mark a benchmark before disturbing ground around it, and she lay down close to the wall, with her coat pulled tight, listening to the willow and the dry creek and the particular silence of a place that had been keeping something for a very long time and had never once been asked to give it up. Morning came the color of skimmed milk, the sky low and even and giving no shadow, and she woke stiff along one hip from the stone floor, and lay still a moment, listening for whatever had woken her before she understood. It was only the cold, deeper now than any morning since she had started the roof. She built the fire back from coal before she did anything else. Feeding it slivers of willow bark and the driest of the cedar splinters, she kept wrapped in a square of oilcloth for exactly such mornings. And only when the flame stood up steady did she allow herself to look again at the base course, and the 4 recesses she had marked in the dark by feel and memory. In daylight, they were almost nothing: a slight discoloration in the mortar, a hairline where the joint ran too straight to be accidental, a shadow no wider than a knife blade, where the stone had been dressed square, instead of left to its natural face, the way the rest of the course had been laid. She had walked past 2 of them a dozen times in the last 3 weeks without seeing them, and she understood that this had been the point, that whoever laid this course, whether it was her grandfather working alone in some season she had never been told about, or the 2 of them together on a trip she had been too young to keep, had built to be overlooked by anyone who did not already know to look. She did not touch the mortar yet. She made herself eat first, a strip of dried venison and the heel of bread going stiff in its cloth, and she told herself this was patience, the same patience he had drilled into her over 100 small stones before he ever let her set a large one. But she knew also that some part of her was afraid of what 4 recesses mortared shut that carefully might mean, and what they might not mean, and how a person could spend a whole winter warm and proud inside a wall and never know it had been keeping a secret from her the entire time. The frost had drawn a thin white lace along the north face of the dam where the sun never reached it, and she studied that instead for a while, letting her breath fog and clear, before she finally took up the smallest of her chisels and knelt at the recess nearest the old spillway gate. The mortar there was old lime, gone soft at its outer skin, the way lime mortar does after enough winters, and when she set the chisel's edge against the seam and gave it the lightest possible tap, a curl of it came away clean as a fingernail paring, and beneath it, packed close and deliberate, she saw not stone at all, but the corner of something wrapped in oiled canvas, dark with age, waiting exactly where it had been left. She did not touch it at first. She only knelt there with the chisel loose in her hand and looked at that corner of canvas the way a person looks at a letter addressed in a dead relation's writing, knowing that whatever it says will now be true in a way it was not true the moment before the seal was broken. The cold had settled into her knees through her skirt, and somewhere behind her a branch let go of its snow load with a soft, collapsing sound, and still she did not move, because some part of her understood that this was the last moment in which the winter belonged only to her and to the house she had built, before it belonged also to whatever her grandfather had decided, years before she was born into any of this trouble, that she should someday find. She worked the mortar loose with the patience he had taught her to use on stone that did not want to give up its shape, a little at a time, never forcing, letting the material tell her when it was ready. It took the better part of an hour to free the recess enough to draw the bundle out whole, and when she finally lifted it free of the wall, it was heavier than its size suggested, dense in the way that oiled canvas wrapped around iron or lead will be dense, and cold clean through, as though it had never once, in all the years it sat there, been touched by any warmth at all. She carried it inside, without unwrapping it, setting it on the plank table beside the lantern, and she built up the fire first, because he had also taught her that a person ought never to do important work with cold hands, that cold hands make a man careless with either a chisel or a decision. She warmed her palms at the flame until the ache went out of her knuckles, and only then did she draw her belt knife and begin to cut the twine that bound the canvas, the strands coming apart with a small, dry sound like something exhaling after a long-held breath. The canvas peeled back in stiff, reluctant folds, releasing a smell of tallow and old iron, and beneath it she found not the tools or trinkets she had half expected, but a flat lead box, seamed and soldered shut, its surface dulled to the color of a winter sky, bearing no mark upon it save, pressed faintly into the metal near one corner, the same surveyor's cross he had scratched into every stake and ledger and stone she had ever seen pass through his hands. She set her fingers against that small mark, and did not move them for a long moment, and outside the window the snow kept falling, steady and unhurried, as though the whole white world had agreed to wait with her while she decided whether she was ready to open it. She did not open it at once. She set it on the table before her, squared it against the grain of the wood, the way he had taught her to square a stone before setting mortar, and she looked at it the way she had learned to look at land before breaking ground, not for what it seemed to hold, but for what it might be hiding beneath its plainest face. The fire popped once, low, and she rose to feed it another length of split cedar, and the small delay was not fear exactly, though it wore fear's shape. It was the particular hesitation of a person who has waited so long for a thing that she distrusts the ease of finally having it in her hands. She thought of him then, not as he had been in the last winter of his life, thin and slow and given to long silences, but as he had been when she was 8 years old, and small enough to ride on his shoulders across the shallows of the river, his voice explaining without condescension why a stone that looked solid could be rotten at its heart, and why a stone that looked ordinary could be the one holding up everything above it. He had never spoken to her the way grown men often spoke to girls, as though patience were a kindness one bestowed rather than a debt one owed. He had simply assumed she could learn, and so she had learned, and the box on the table in front of her was, she understood now, only another lesson arriving late, the way some of his lessons had a way of doing, planted years before they were needed, waiting in the ground like a root crop for a winter he must have known was coming, even if she had not. She found her knife again and worked the blade along the solder seam, patient, unhurried, the way he had taught her to work a mortar joint that had set too hard, never forcing it, only finding the place where it wanted to give. The lead was old and tired, and it surrendered in small curling flakes, and when she finally lifted the lid, the hinge gave a thin metallic complaint that seemed too loud for the quiet room. Inside lay a field book, its leather cover swollen and softened with damp long since dried, and beneath it a single folded document sealed in oiled cloth, the kind of cloth he had always kept for papers that mattered, the kind he had used, she remembered now with a small cold jolt, for nothing else in the whole of his life that she had ever seen. She did not unfold either one yet. She only sat with her hands resting on top of them, feeling the shape of what was underneath, while the snow went on falling outside the window, indifferent and endless, and the fire settled lower in the hearth behind her. The lamp had burned low enough that she rose once to trim the wick, and in that small practical motion, the striking of the match, the brief flare against her cupped palm, she felt her own hands steady in a way they had not been since she pried the stone loose. She sat again. She told herself she was only cold, that the shaking she noticed in her fingers was the draft finding its way down through the new chimney, though she had built that chimney herself and knew it did not draw a draft that way. She did not say the word fear to herself. She only noticed that her breath had gone shallow, and that she was listening to the fire the way a person listens for a second set of footsteps. The field book, when she finally drew it toward her, smelled of the specific must of paper that had spent decades inside stone and lead and cloth, a smell with no name she knew, except that it was the smell of her grandfather's traveling trunk in the years after he stopped traveling, the trunk that had sat under the window of the room he'd given her, the trunk she had been forbidden, gently but absolutely, to open. She had never asked why. Some rules a child simply keeps, the way she had kept his rule about never setting a level on wet stone. She opened the cover with 2 fingers, the way one opens a door into a room where someone might be sleeping. The handwriting inside was his. She would have known it blind, would have known it by the particular slant he gave his sevens, a habit he said he'd picked up from a Kentucky surveyor 40 years dead by the time he taught it to her. The early pages held ordinary things, bearings, distances, a note about a mule gone lame at a crossing she did not recognize. She turned slowly, the way she turned pages in weather cold enough to crack them, and the entries began to gather around a single stretch of river, the same bend, page after page, the same set of markers driven and redriven, until the dates themselves began to matter more than what they described. She stopped turning when she reached a page where the ink changed, darker, fresher, written, she understood without being told, sometime after everything else in the book had already dried. It was not a survey line. It was a single sentence, unhurried, in his hand, addressed to no one, and therefore, she understood, with the particular ache of the newly orphaned, all over again, addressed entirely to her. She did not read it aloud. She only sat with it in the lamplight, the snow outside the window falling the way it had been falling for hours, patient and unbothered by what it was covering, while the oiled cloth beneath the field book waited, still folded, still sealed, still hers, to open when her hands were ready. The lamp had burned low enough that its light no longer reached the far corners of the room, and still she sat without moving, the field book open on her knee, the single sentence in her grandfather's fresher ink waiting for her, the way it had waited, she supposed, for 11 years already, folded into paper and lead and riverstone, patient in a way only the dead can afford to be. She counted the words instead of reading them again. 12. She had counted them the first time too, and the number had not changed, and there was some comfort in that, in the fact that a thing could be measured and remain exactly what it was, unlike almost everything else that had happened to her since the morning her stepfather had counted out $11.40 onto a kitchen table and called it settled. She set the field book down at last, gently, the way she had learned to set down anything she meant to trust with weight later, and she looked instead at the oiled cloth still folded beneath it. She did not open it that night. She told herself it was because her hands were cold, and this was true, but it was not the whole truth, and she knew it the way she knew the sound of ice forming on a water barrel before she ever saw it, a knowledge that arrived through the skin before it arrived through the eyes. What waited inside that cloth had waited this long. It could wait until morning, until she had slept, until the wind outside had finished whatever argument it was having with the walls of the house he had built and she had rebuilt, stone answering stone, the way his sentences answered hers, now across 11 years of silence. She banked the fire low, the coals settling into themselves with a small, private sound, and she lay down on the pallet with her boots still on, which she had not done since the first nights on the trail, when she had not yet trusted the ground beneath her to hold still until morning. The compass sat where it always sat, on the shelf above her, its glass catching what little light remained, and she found herself listening to it, the way a person listens to another person breathing in the next room, not for any particular sound, but for the reassurance that the sound continued. Outside, the snow did not slacken. It came down steady and unhurried across the collapsed dam stones, across the old markers her grandfather had driven, and driven again, as if he had known, even then, that a single staking would not be believed, across the river bend that had been his, and was, she understood now, with the ink still drying somewhere behind her closed eyes, about to become entirely her own. She slept before she meant to, the field book closed beside her, the oiled cloth still sealed, and the 12 words waiting, unread again until morning, for the daughter of no one in particular to decide she was ready. Morning came the color of a dropped coin, dull silver light pressing flat against the small high window she had chipped into the stone wall for exactly this purpose, so that she would always know without opening the door whether the world outside had turned white or merely gray. It had turned white. She lay a moment longer than she needed to, listening to the particular silence that only comes after a night of steady snow, a silence with weight to it, the walls themselves seeming to hold their breath, and she thought of her grandfather's hands guiding hers over a chisel 30 years before either of them had reason to think this room would ever exist, and she thought that a man who plans this far ahead does not do so out of hope alone but out of a kind of stubbornness she was only now old enough to recognize in herself. She rose, boots still on from the night before, and did not immediately reach for the oiled cloth. There was a discipline in that, a discipline he had taught her without ever naming it, that a thing worth reading is worth reading with a clear head and a full stomach, and that hunger makes a person careless with meaning. So she built the fire first, coaxed it from the banked coals the way he had shown her when she was no higher than his belt, feeding it in small increments, patient, unhurried, and she set the coffee to warm and ate the last of the dried venison from the tin, chewing slowly, watching the frost etch itself finer across the window glass with each passing minute. Only then did she sit at the little table she had built from dam cribbing timber and lay the field book open before her, the 12 words from the night before still sitting where she had left them, black ink against the pale grain of the page, waiting the way patient things wait, without complaint. She did not read them again yet. She turned instead to the pages that came after, the ones she had not reached, and found more of his handwriting there, smaller, tighter, as though he had grown more careful the closer he came to whatever it was he had been building toward. And among the surveyor's marks and bearings and elevations there were names, names of men she had never heard, dates that reached back further than her own memory could touch, and a phrase, underlined twice, that made her set the book down and press both palms flat against the table, as if the wood itself might steady her. Outside, the snow kept falling, indifferent to what a person inside a stone house might be learning about the ground beneath her feet, and she sat very still and read it again. The phrase was this: "Staked in trust, not in title, for the child not yet born." She did not understand it at first, the way one does not understand a stranger's face glimpsed once in poor light, familiar in a way that troubled more than it clarified. She read the line above it, the line below it, the bearings that framed it like fence posts around a plot no one had walked in decades, and slowly the meaning settled into her, the way cold settles into stone, not all at once, but from the outside in, until it reached the center and would not be dislodged. Her grandfather had not staked the river bend only for himself. He had staked it a second time, in a separate filing dated 11 months after the first, naming an heir he did not name outright, but described only as the child not yet born to his daughter, her mother, who at that time had been carrying her, though no one in the family, by her grandfather's own careful account, had spoken the fact aloud yet. He had known before it was proper to know. He had ridden to the county seat, alone, in what the entry called a hard rain, in late October, and filed the second claim not to protect the land from her stepfather, who did not yet exist in any of their lives, but from the ordinary erosions of time, a family's forgetting, a courthouse fire, a clerk's careless hand, the erosions that take a thing not by violence, but by simple neglect, the same erosions that had nearly taken the dam itself. She thought of her mother, young and unmarried and not yet showing, walking the same ground she now sat beneath, unaware that her father had already gone ahead of her and written her unborn child into the county's permanent record. She thought of the years since, the ranch, the ledgers, the $10 counted out on a cold morning, and how none of it had ever once been necessary, how the worthlessness she had been sent away with had been, since before her birth, a fiction resting on top of a fact no one alive had thought to check. The snow pressed at the small window above the table, and the lamp burned low and steady, and she sat with the field book open before her, and did not move for a long while, because there are discoveries that ask to be run toward, and there are discoveries that ask only to be sat with, quietly, until the body catches up to what the mind has already understood. When the body did catch up, it did so slowly, the way frost loosens from a window pane not all at once, but in a spreading warmth from one corner outward. She closed the field book before she read further, not because she feared what else was written there, but because she understood, with the same instinct her grandfather had trained into her hands when he first set a level against a stone, that a thing this large ought not be taken in all at once. She banked the fire lower. She ate a little of the dried apple she had been saving. She lay on the narrow cot with the lead box still open on the table, and the lamp finally out, and she did not sleep so much as pass through a long, wakeful dimness in which the events of her 19 years rearranged themselves into a different order, not a story of a girl sent away from land that was never hers, but a story of a girl sent away from land that had, all along, been waiting for her to come back and stand on it. In the morning, the storm had not lifted. It would not lift, in truth, for 4 more days, the wind working itself into a steady, low howl above the stone roof, the snow piling against the door, until she had to brace her shoulder against it each dawn, to press it open a hand's width and no more. But she did not mind the confinement now the way she might have minded it a week before. She had the field book, and she read it by lamplight in small sections, the way a person eats after a long fast, careful not to take in more than the body could hold. Her grandfather's hand had grown shakier toward the last entries, the ink paler, the dates closer together as though he had sensed some narrowing of his own time and wanted the record complete before it ran out. He had written the courses and distances of the bend 3 separate times across 3 separate years, as if returning again and again to confirm what he had already proven, the way a man touches a scar to be certain it is still there. She thought, on the 3rd snowbound day, of the deed itself, folded in its oilcloth beneath the field book, the notary's seal still legible, the witness name still legible, everything a court would need already assembled and waiting, as though he had built not only a house of stone against the weather, but a case of paper against forgetting, and had trusted that someday someone with reason to look would look. She had not gone looking. She had only needed a wall reinforced against the cold. The snow held through the middle weeks of that season, with a patience that matched her own, and she kept to a rhythm she had built without meaning to build it, waking before the light to check the small stove, running her palm along the mortar joints to feel for damp, reading a page or two of the field book only after the day's chores were finished, so that the old man's voice came to her, always at the end of things, never at the start. She had begun to notice how the entries changed in tone as well as hand. In the earliest pages, he wrote like a man reporting to a superior, precise, unadorned, the language of a survey submitted for record. But in the later pages, the ones written closest to the dam itself, he had begun addressing no one in particular, noting the color of the water in October, the particular slant of light on the bend at 4 in the afternoon, small observations that had no bearing on any boundary or courthouse ledger. She understood, reading them, that he had not been thinking only of proof when he sealed that lead box into the stone. He had been thinking of a record that might outlast the argument itself, a private accounting kept in case the public one failed him, the way a careful man keeps a second set of figures, not from dishonesty, but from knowing how easily the first set could be lost to fire, or flood, or someone else's convenience. She thought of her stepfather then, briefly, without heat. She wondered whether he had known, in some buried corner of his own ledger-keeping mind, that the bend had never truly been his to claim, and had simply chosen not to look for what might complicate a use he found convenient. It was not a kindness to imagine, but it was not without a kind of mercy either, the mercy of understanding a man's blindness as something built from habit rather than malice, the same blindness that had signed her out of the house with $11.40 and called it fair. The stove ticked as it cooled. Outside, the wind had dropped to something almost gentle, and through the small window she had set into the north wall, she could see the drifted white going faintly blue in the last of the daylight. She closed the field book carefully, the way one closes a door on a room still occupied, and set it beside the deed in its oilcloth, and sat for a long while doing nothing at all, letting the weight of what she now knew settle into her the way heat settles into stone, slowly and completely, and without asking permission. She did not sleep that night in the way sleep is usually understood, as an absence, a going under. She lay on the cot with the field book returned to its place beside her, and drifted instead through a shallow, half-lit wakefulness in which she kept seeing her grandfather's hands, the specific way his thumb had pressed the brass of the compass when he taught her to sight a line, the callus along the second finger, worn smooth from decades of chalk line and chisel. She had not thought of his hands in that much detail in years, and it startled her now, how completely they returned to her, as though the finding of the box had loosened something else in her that had been sealed just as long. Toward morning she rose, built up the stove, and made the coffee strong the way he had taught her to make it on cold mornings at the quarry, and she drank it standing at the north window watching the light come up gray and then pale gold across the drifted snow. And she thought, he built this dam knowing it might one day need to speak for him. That was the thought that would not leave her. A man does not seal a deed into a wall of stone unless some part of him suspects he will not be present to defend it with his voice. He had left his voice inside the wall instead, patient as the stone itself, waiting out however many winters it took for someone with the skill to find it. She understood, sitting with that thought, that the skill he had given her was never only about laying stone true or reading a slope for water. It had always, from the very first lesson, been preparation for this exact kind of listening, the kind that lets a person hear an old man's intention buried 30 years deep in rock. She spent the following days in a strange, suspended calm, tending the stove, rationing the last of the dried apples, walking the perimeter of the buried house each clear afternoon to check the drift lines against the walls, and each evening returning to the oilcloth bundle to read another page of the field book by lamplight, learning the bend of the river as her grandfather had known it, decades before either flood or dam or stepfather's fences had reshaped it. The names in the margins meant nothing to her, old surveyors, a county clerk long dead. But the numbers held steady, patient, exact, the way he had always insisted numbers should be kept, and she copied them by hand into a notebook of her own, not because she doubted the deed, but because copying was itself a kind of listening, the way he had taught her that repetition was how a hand learns to trust a measurement it cannot yet fully understand. The blizzard came on the 9th night, not with warning, but with a change in the sound of the wind against the stovepipe, a low, sustained note that had not been there an hour before, and she banked the fire high and sat with the compass in her palm and listened to the storm find every seam in the stonework she had cut and fitted with her own hands. It did not find many. Where the wind pressed hardest against the north wall, the wall held the silence her grandfather had always said good stone should hold. Not the silence of nothing happening, but the silence of weight settled correctly, each course bearing exactly what it was cut to bear. She thought, sitting there, of the years she had spent believing his lessons were only about rock and water and the patient arithmetic of a level line, and she understood now, with the wind howling 3 feet above her roof and unable to touch her, that he had been teaching her the shape of an argument as much as the shape of a wall, that a claim, like a foundation, either bears weight or it does not, and no amount of shouting from either side changes what the stone itself will do when the snow finally comes. She did not sleep well that first night of true winter, not from fear, but from a kind of vigilance she could not set down, rising twice to check the stovepipe draft, and once simply to stand in the dark hallway she had carved, and place her palm flat against the cold stone, feeling for any tremor of settling that might mean a fault she had missed. There was none. By the 3rd day the drifts outside had buried the entrance almost to the lintel, and she dug a narrow channel each morning with the flat shovel, packing the snow into blocks along the sides, the way he had once shown her men did in the far north country he had read about, but never seen, and she found a strange satisfaction in the labor, a rhythm that asked nothing of her but repetition, and gave back, each time, the small proof that the door still opened, that the fire still drew, that the field book and the folded deed still lay dry and unbroken in their oilcloth, beneath the lamp shelf, where she had set them like something waiting to be carried somewhere else, come spring, when the roads would open and the county seat would still be sitting exactly where it had always sat, indifferent to how long a claim had gone unspoken. The winter did not pass so much as it accumulated, the way snow accumulates, one still hour laid over another, until the sum of them became a season she could measure only by the level of oil left in the lamp and the number of times she had re-sewn the seam of her glove where the wool had worn through at the thumb. She kept a tally on the inside of the stovepipe casing, a small mark scratched with the point of her grandfather's old awl for each morning she woke beneath stone instead of sky, and by the count of 61 marks, she understood that she had outlasted the worst of what the mountain could send down on a person alone, and had done it warm, and had done it dry, and had done it without once hearing, in the black hours before dawn, any voice telling her the ground beneath her belonged to someone else's ledger. She read the field book slowly, a page some nights and no pages on others, rationing it the way she rationed the coffee, because she understood, without deciding to, that once she had read it through, there would be nothing left of him to discover, only what remained to be done with what he had left. His hand was small and even, the numbers marching in disciplined columns down each page, bearings and chain lengths, and the elevations he had taken at the bend of the river, before the dam was ever more than a notion sketched in the margin, and here and there, between the surveys, a line that was not measurement at all, a note on the weather that day, a remark about the color of the water in October, a single sentence about a granddaughter not yet born, who he hoped might someday walk this ground and know it as her own. She read that sentence 4 times before she closed the book and sat for a long while with her hand over her mouth, not weeping, only holding herself steady against something too large to weep at properly. Outside, the wind kept its long, unbroken argument with the rock, and inside the fire held its low orange line against the dark, and she began, without quite naming it to herself as a decision, to think forward, past the snow, to the road once it thawed, to the courthouse steps she had never climbed, to the clerk, who would ask her name and would have to write it down exactly as the deed gave it, in ink, in a book that did not forget. The winter did not soften after that night, but she found she no longer measured it by its cruelty. She measured it instead by the small tasks that filled it, mortar mixed thin enough to work in cold hands, a hinge oiled with rendered fat, the field book read again and again, until its ink lived in her memory as surely as her grandfather's voice once had. She kept the lead box on the shelf beside the compass, and some evenings she simply looked at the two of them together, the brass and the lead, as though they were two old men agreeing quietly on something long settled. Spring came the way it does in that country, not gently but suddenly, the river loosening in a single loud week, the snow retreating up the canyon walls until only thin white seams remained in the shadowed cracks. She rode out on a morning with new grass showing pale green through last year's dead stalks, the deed folded inside her coat, where she could feel its shape against her ribs the whole way down the valley. The county seat had not changed in the time she had been gone, the same dust in the street, the same flag hanging limp against its pole, but she walked into the clerk's office differently than she had ever walked anywhere before, not asking, only stating. The clerk read the deed twice, looked at her once, and asked her to spell her name, which she did, slowly, watching him write each letter into the book that did not forget. She did not ride back to her stepfather's ranch. She sent, instead, by way of a freighter heading north, her mother's old shawl, washed and folded square, with no letter tucked inside it, because there was nothing left to explain that the folding itself did not already say. She built the rest of the house through that first full summer, above ground now, walls rising from the same river stone in the same pattern her hands had learned in the dark of the dam, and when autumn came again, a full year, to the day, from the morning she had stood in the yard with $11.40 and no name that mattered to anyone, she set the compass on the mantle of a home that owed its existence to no one's charity. People still called that stretch of river worthless when they spoke of it at all. She never corrected them. She only kept living there, deliberately, season after season, in the one place on earth that had finally been written down, in ink,